A morning of hope and despair. The golden hues of the early morning sun painted the quiet streets, casting long shadows across the sleepy neighborhood. Keanu Reeves strolled down the sidewalk, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. His casual attire, faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a loose-fitting flannel shirt, blended seamlessly with the early risers around him. Few would have guessed that this unassuming man was one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. Keanu's destination was just a few blocks away. Paws of Hope Animal Rescue. The shelter held a special place in his heart, and over the years, he had quietly donated substantial funds to help keep it running. Today, however, wasn't about donations or publicity. It was a rare day off from his busy schedule, and he wanted to spend it helping the animals. As the large sign of the shelter came into view, its bright lettering seemed to promise warmth and compassion. The words "Paws of Hope" danced cheerfully in the sunlight, but Keanu couldn't help noticing the somber undertone of the place, a reminder of the struggles faced by abandoned and abused animals. He reached for the shelter's glass door, but just as he did, it swung open violently. "Watch it," snapped a man in a white coat, foam pressed tightly to his ear. The man barely spared Keanu a glance as he stormed past, his voice sharp and dismissive. "No free patients today. I don't care if they're already in the clinic. If they can't pay, they're out." Keanu took a step back, startled by the man's abruptness. Before he could respond, the man disappeared into the parking lot, still engrossed in his heated phone conversation. Shaking his head, Keanu pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar cacophony of the shelter greeted him. Dogs barked from their kennels, cats meowed from their perches, and the faint chirping of birds added a soft background melody. The mingling scents of animals and disinfectant filled the air, a smell Keanu had come to associate with both heartbreak and hope. At the reception desk, a cheerful woman looked up from her paperwork, her face lit up with recognition. "Mr. Reeves," she exclaimed, her warm smile brightening the room. "What a wonderful surprise." "Hi, Nina," Keanu replied, his own smile matching hers. "Thought I'd drop by and see how you're doing." Nina's expression faltered slightly, her enthusiasm dimming. "It's been challenging," she admitted. "We just had a situation with one of our older dogs. He's got a tumor in his abdomen, and we had to call in a vet. The one we usually work with is out of town." Keanu's brows furrowed with concern. "Was that the guy I just saw leaving?" He seemed upset. Nina nodded reluctantly. "That's him. Dr. Porter. He's difficult, to say the least. But he's skilled, and we didn't have any other options." Keanu felt a pang of regret for not engaging with the man earlier. The brief encounter replayed in his mind, and the vet's harsh tone left a sour taste in his mouth. But for now, he pushed those thoughts aside. "Where's Chris?" he asked, referring to the shelter's manager and his longtime friend. "In the back with the dog," Nina replied, gesturing toward a door behind her. "He'd be thrilled to see you. Go on in." Keanu thanked her and made his way through the shelter. Rows of kennels lined the walls, each housing a furry occupant with their own unique story. As he walked, he stopped occasionally to greet the animals, his heart swelling with a mix of sadness and determination. These creatures deserved better, and he was determined to help in any way he could. In the main shelter area, Keanu found Chris kneeling beside a kennel. The man's kind eyes and patient demeanor were a testament to his dedication. He was gently coaxing an elderly Labrador to take some pills, his voice soft and soothing. "Keanu," Chris exclaimed, standing up to greet his friend. His smile was broad and genuine, a rare sight in the often overwhelming world of animal rescue. "What a surprise. I didn't know you were in town." Keanu returned the handshake with equal warmth. "Wrapped up a project early and thought I'd stop by. Nina mentioned you've got a tough case on your hands." Chris sighed, glancing back at the kennel. "Yeah, this guy's been with us for years, but he's not doing well. The tumor's aggressive, and the vet we called wasn't exactly compassionate." Keanu nodded, his mind flashing back to the man in the parking lot. I think I ran into him. He didn't seem particularly interested in helping. Chris hesitated before responding, his voice tinged with frustration. Porter's good at what he does, but he's in it for the money. It's hard to find vets willing to work with shelters like ours, especially on short notice. The two men continued talking as they walked along the kennels. Despite the challenges, the shelter was a place of hope. The animals, though scared by their pasts, were well cared for, their wagging tails and eager purrs a testament to the love they received. Chris suddenly stopped, a hint of excitement in his voice. Oh, I almost forgot. We've got a new arrival I think you'll want to meet. He led Keanu to a kennel near the back and carefully opened the door. This is Bruno. A German shepherd stepped cautiously out, his eyes darting around nervously. His fur was patchy and scars marked his lean frame, but there was a quiet nobility about him. Despite his weariness, he carried himself with a dignified air. Bruno's a survivor, Chris explained. He was found in a trash truck, abandoned and injured. If the garbage collector hadn't spotted him, he wouldn't have made it. Keanu crouched down, extending a hand toward Bruno. Hey, buddy, he said softly. The dog sniffed his hand hesitantly before allowing Keanu to gently stroke his head. Chris continued, his voice heavy with emotion. He's been through hell, malnourished, injured, and even suffering from seizures. But he's a fighter. We're doing everything we can to help him recover. Keanu felt a surge of anger and sadness at the thought of someone treating an animal so callously. But as he looked into Bruno's eyes, he also felt a renewed sense of purpose. You're doing incredible work here, Chris, he said. How can I help? Chris smiled, his gratitude evident. Just being here means a lot. But if you really want to make a difference. He hesitated, as if unsure whether to voice his thoughts. Keanu encouraged him with a nod, and Chris continued. We've been dreaming of expanding the shelter. A bigger space would mean more room for animals like Bruno to heal and find homes. But it's a big dream, and we'll need all the help we can get. Keanu's mind raced with possibilities. He had the resources, the connections, and the determination to make this dream a reality. As he stood beside Bruno, gently stroking the dog's fur, he knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his commitment to animal rescue. But neither Keanu nor Chris could have anticipated the challenges that lay ahead. The events of the coming days would test their resolve, their patience, and their belief in the goodness of people, and would ultimately reveal the true depths of compassion and courage. A shattered trust. Keanu Reeves couldn't shake the weight of his encounter with Bruno and Chris as he walked out of the shelter. The image of the German shepherd, scarred, fragile, yet dignified, stayed with him. Bruno represented the very reason shelters like Paws of Hope existed, to heal, protect, and offer second chances to those who had been betrayed by humanity. The sunlight was warmer now, painting the streets in golden hues. Keanu decided to grab coffee at a nearby cafe, intending to let his thoughts settle before returning to the shelter later in the day. He replayed the morning's events in his mind. The curt vet, Chris's struggles, and Bruno's soulful eyes. Something about the vet's cold demeanor didn't sit right with him. As he turned onto the main road, the quaint cafe came into view, its outdoor seating scattered with locals enjoying their morning brews. The small bell above the door chimed softly as Keanu stepped inside. The barista, a young woman with bright eyes, greeted him with a cheerful smile. She didn't seem to recognize him, and he was glad for it. Today, he wanted to blend into the crowd. Just a black coffee, please, he said, sliding a few bills across the counter. As he waited for his order, Keanu overheard a conversation between two patrons seated near the window. Their voices were low, but the mention of Dr. Porter caught his attention. Yeah, I heard he turned someone away again this morning, one of them said, shaking his head. Poor guy couldn't afford the treatment for his dog, and Porter refused to even look at it. The other man sighed, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. It's not the first time. My sister went to him last month when her cat got sick. She said he spent more time talking about his fees than actually examining the cat. She ended up taking it to another clinic. Keanu felt his jaw tighten. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the vet's behavior earlier, and now this, painted a troubling picture. As he collected his coffee and left the cafe, his resolve hardened. If Dr. Porter was exploiting his position, Keanu couldn't stand by and do nothing. Back at the shelter, Chris was preparing to feed the animals when Keanu returned. Bruno was in his kennel, resting comfortably after their earlier meeting. The sight of the German shepherd lying peacefully was a balm to Keanu's racing mind. Chris noticed Keanu's thoughtful expression and approached him, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You look like you've got something on your mind," he said, a note of concern in his voice. Keanu hesitated before answering. "I overheard something at the cafe just now, about Dr. Porter. It sounds like he has a reputation for turning away people who can't pay up front." Chris sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I hate to say it, but that doesn't surprise me. He's been like that for as long as I've known him. He's one of the few vets willing to work with shelters, but only when it suits him. The moment money becomes an issue, he's out." "Has he ever done that to you?" Keanu asked, his voice low. Chris nodded reluctantly. "A few times. There was a case last year, an injured stray we found near the highway. Porter agreed to treat him at first, but when we couldn't pay his full fee immediately, he left before the treatment was complete. The dog didn't make it." Keanu's hands curled into fists at his sides. "That's unacceptable." Chris gave him a weary smile. "It is. But what can we do? Shelters like ours don't have many options. Most vets are too busy or too expensive. Porter knows that, and he takes advantage of it." Keanu's eyes hardened with determination. "That's going to change." The next morning, Keanu arrived at the shelter bright and early, a plan already forming in his mind. He had spent the night researching local veterinary clinics, making calls, and compiling information. He wanted to understand the bigger picture before taking action. Chris was surprised to see him so early. "You're back already?" he asked with a grin. "Not that I'm complaining." Keanu returned the smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I couldn't stop thinking about Bruno, and about what you said yesterday." Chris's expression turned serious. "What's on your mind?" "I want to look into Dr. Porter. Not just him, but the whole system. If vets like him are exploiting shelters and pet owners, we need to expose it, and we need to find better options for shelters like yours." Chris raised an eyebrow. "That's a tall order, Keanu. Even for you." Keanu shrugged. "I've handled worse. Besides, I'm not doing this alone. I'm counting on you to help me." Chris chuckled, but there was a note of gratitude in his voice. "You've got my full support, man. Whatever you need." Later that day, Keanu visited Bright Care Veterinary Clinic, the facility where Dr. Porter worked. The sleek, modern building exuded professionalism, but Keanu couldn't shake the unease that settled in his chest as he approached the glass doors. The receptionist, a sharp-featured woman with a polished demeanor, looked up as he entered. "Good afternoon," she said with a practiced smile. "How can I help you?" Keanu hesitated for a moment, then decided to test the waters. "I'm here about my dog. He's been having seizures." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly as she took in his casual attire. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, it's an emergency," Keanu said. Her expression hardened. "I'm sorry, but we don't take walk-ins. You'll need to schedule an appointment. And just so you're aware, we require payment upfront for all services." Keanu felt a flash of anger, but kept his tone calm. "What if I can't pay upfront?" The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Then I suggest you find another clinic." Keanu's jaw tightened. "Is Dr. Porter available? I'd like to speak with him." The receptionist sighed, clearly irritated. "Dr. Porter is very busy. Unless you're a registered client, he won't be able to see you." Before Keanu could respond, the door to the clinic opened, and a well-dressed man entered, carrying a small dog in his arms. The receptionist's demeanor changed instantly. Her smile returned, warm and welcoming. "Mr. Johnson," she said brightly. "How's Bella today? Dr. Porter will see you right away." Keanu watched the interaction in silence, his suspicions confirmed. It wasn't just about emergencies or schedules. It was about money and appearances. He turned and left the clinic, his mind racing. This wasn't just a personal grievance anymore. It was a systemic issue, and he was determined to do something about it. Back at the shelter, Keanu shared his experience with Chris. "It's worse than I thought," he said, pacing the small office. "They're prioritizing wealthy clients over emergencies. It's not about the animals, it's about profit." Chris nodded grimly. "That's been my experience too. And the worst part is, there's not much we can do. Without vets, shelters like ours can't survive." Keanu stopped pacing and turned to Chris. "Then we'll change the system. If vets like Dr. Porter won't do the right thing, we'll find ones who will. And we'll make sure shelters like yours have the resources to operate independently." Chris frowned. "That's a big undertaking, Keanu. You're talking about taking on the entire veterinary industry." Keanu's eyes gleamed with determination. "If that's what it takes to protect animals like Bruno, then so be it." As the sun set over the shelter, Keanu and Chris began brainstorming their next steps. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they couldn't stand by and let injustice continue. The fight had only just begun, and they were ready to see it through, no matter the cost. The silent battle. The next morning dawned cold and gray, a stark contrast to the vibrant determination burning in Keanu Reeves's heart. He arrived at Paws of Hope Animal Rescue earlier than usual, his mind racing with plans for the day. Bruno's soft, inquisitive eyes had stayed with him through the night, their unspoken pleas strengthening his resolve. The German Shepherd deserved better. They all did. Chris was already in the main kennel area when Keanu walked in, feeding the animals and humming softly to himself. He glanced up at the sound of footsteps and broke into a grin. "You're turning into a regular around here, Keanu," he teased, setting down the bowl of kibble he'd been holding. Keanu returned the smile but wasted no time diving into the reason for his early visit. "Chris, I've been thinking a lot about yesterday," he began. "I don't just want to expose Dr. Porter's practices. I want to start building something better. A system where shelters like yours don't have to rely on people like him." Chris raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You've got my attention. What are you thinking?" "I want to build a network," Keanu said, his voice gaining momentum. "We'll partner with vets who share our values, people who care more about saving lives than padding their pockets. We'll create a fund specifically for emergency care, so no animal is ever turned away because of money. And we'll find ways to support shelters like Paws of Hope, so you're never stuck in a situation like this again." Chris crossed his arms, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "That's a bold plan, Keanu. But it's going to take a lot of resources and a lot of buy-in from the right people." "I know," Keanu replied, "but I've got connections. And I've got you. Together, we can make this happen." Chris smiled, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're something else, man. All right, count me in. What's the first step?" Building bridges. Later that day, Keanu sat in the small office at the back of the shelter, a laptop in front of him and a notebook filled with scribbled ideas by his side. He had already reached out to several contacts in the entertainment industry, asking for support. Many of them, like Keanu, had a soft spot for animals and were more than willing to contribute to his vision. He was in the middle of drafting an email to a prominent veterinary association when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Chris. "Chris, you might want to come to the front desk. There's someone here asking for you." Keanu frowned, confused. Setting aside his work, he made his way to the reception area. Standing just inside the door was a familiar figure, the homeless man he had encountered outside Brightcare Veterinary Clinic the day before. His small dog, Max, was perched on his shoulder, looking far healthier than he had during their first meeting. "Billy," Keanu said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Billy's face lit up with relief when he saw Keanu. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I went to the shelter you told me about. And your friend Chris." He paused, glancing at Chris, who was watching from behind the counter. "He took care of Max. No questions asked." Keanu's chest swelled with pride as he looked over at Chris, who gave him a small nod and a smile. "Max is doing much better now," Billy continued, scratching the little dog behind the ears. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." Keanu stepped forward and placed a hand on Billy's shoulder. "I'm just glad Max is okay. That's what matters." But Billy wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, his voice lowering as he glanced around nervously. "After what happened yesterday, I started asking around. Turns out, Dr. Porter's clinic isn't the only one doing this. There's a few other places around here that treat animals like a business instead of lives that need saving. People are afraid to speak up, but I thought you should know." Keanu's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. "You're sure about this?" Billy nodded. "Yeah, and if you need help proving it, I can talk to some of the people I've met. A lot of them have stories." Keanu exchanged a glance with Chris, who looked just as troubled. "This is bigger than we thought," Chris said. "If it's not just Porter, but other clinics too." Keanu nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we need to dig deeper. Billy, would you be willing to share what you know? Anything you've heard or seen could help." Billy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not great with talking to people," he admitted. "But if it helps Max and other dogs like him, I'll do it." Keanu smiled reassuringly. "That's all I ask." "Thank you, Billy." Uncovering the truth. Over the next few days, Keanu and Chris worked tirelessly to gather information. Billy introduced them to other pet owners who had been turned away or mistreated by clinics like Dr. Porter's. Each story painted a grim picture of greed and neglect, of animals left to suffer because their owners couldn't pay up front or didn't meet the clinic's standards. One woman, Sarah, tearfully recounted how her cat had died after being refused treatment for a urinary blockage. Another man, Javier, spoke about how he had been charged exorbitant fees for a minor procedure, only to find out later that the treatment had been unnecessary. With each story, Keanu's determination grew. He began compiling a dossier of evidence, complete with testimonies, photos, and receipts. Chris reached out to other shelters in the area, many of which had their own horror stories to share. The tipping point came when a local journalist got wind of what Keanu was doing. The reporter, a young woman named Amelia, approached him at the shelter one evening. "Mr. Reeves," she began, holding out a recorder, "I've been hearing about your efforts to expose unethical practices in veterinary clinics. I'd love to write a piece on it for the local paper." Keanu hesitated. He wasn't one to seek publicity, especially for something so personal. But he also knew that shining a light on the issue was the only way to bring about real change. "All right," he said finally, "but this isn't about me. It's about the animals and the people who care for them. If you're going to write about it, focus on that." Amelia smiled. "Of course. Thank you, Mr. Reeves." A public outcry. A week later, the article was published. Titled "Turning Away Compassion: The Hidden Crisis in Veterinary Care," it quickly gained traction, sparking outrage among readers. Amelia's piece detailed the experiences of pet owners, shelter workers, and volunteers, all of whom had been affected by the practices of clinics like Dr. Porter's. Keanu's involvement added a powerful voice to the cause, drawing attention from media outlets across the country. Chris called Keanu the morning the article went viral. "You've done it, man," he said, his voice filled with awe. "People are talking. They're angry, and they want change." Keanu felt a surge of hope, but he knew this was only the beginning. "We can't stop now," he said. "This is just the first step. We need to keep the pressure on and make sure this leads to real reform." Chris agreed. "Whatever you need, I'm with you." As Keanu hung up the phone, he glanced over at Bruno, who was lying in his bed near the window, basking in the morning sunlight. The German shepherd's tail thumped softly against the floor, as if sensing that something important was happening. Keanu knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "We're going to fix this," he murmured. "For you. For all of them." Bruno looked up at him, his eyes filled with quiet trust. It was all the motivation Keanu needed to keep fighting. Confronting the system. The buzz surrounding the expose, turning away compassion. The hidden crisis in veterinary care had grown far beyond Keanu Reeves's expectations. What started as a local story had spread nationally, igniting debates on news channels, social media, and even in government forums. The article didn't just expose unethical clinics, it struck a chord with pet owners and animal lovers everywhere, shining a light on a broken system that prioritized profits over compassion. Keanu stood in the small office of Paws of Hope, staring at the corkboard Chris had set up on one wall. It was covered in notes, photos, and newspaper clippings, evidence of their investigation and the growing public outrage. Chris sat at the desk, tapping away on his laptop as he updated their growing database of complaints and stories. "Have you seen this?" Chris asked, gesturing to his screen. "Another clinic in the city just got called out. The owner posted a video about how they were denied treatment for their dog because they couldn't pay up front." Keanu nodded grimly. "It's happening everywhere, Chris. But now people are paying attention. This isn't just about a few bad clinics. It's a systemic issue." Chris leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, but how do we fix it? Exposing the problem is one thing. Changing the system, that's a whole different beast." Keanu turned to face him, his expression resolute. "We start by building something better. If the system won't change, we'll create our own." The gathering storm. Over the next few weeks, Keanu and Chris worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. They reached out to ethical veterinarians, animal rights organizations, and philanthropists who shared their passion for animal welfare. The goal was ambitious: to create a nonprofit veterinary network that would provide affordable care to shelters and low-income pet owners, funded by donations and grants. One of their first major supporters was Amelia, the journalist whose article had started the firestorm. She introduced them to a group of investigative reporters who offered to help uncover more unethical practices in the veterinary industry. Armed with this new support, Keanu and Chris expanded their investigation, reaching out to shelters and pet owners across the country. The stories they uncovered were heartbreaking. A single mother had lost her beloved cat because she couldn't afford the $500 deposit required for emergency surgery. An elderly man had to choose between paying for his dog's medication and buying groceries for himself. Shelter workers spoke of being forced to euthanize animals because they couldn't afford treatment. Keanu spent hours on the phone, listening to these stories and promising to help. His reputation as a compassionate and approachable advocate only grew, drawing more attention to their cause. Chris, meanwhile, focused on logistics. He began drafting plans for the first nonprofit veterinary clinic, reaching out to architects, contractors, and suppliers who might be willing to donate their services. He also started looking for locations, targeting areas with high shelter populations and limited access to affordable veterinary care. A personal test. One morning, as Keanu was reviewing a proposal for the nonprofit clinic, he received an unexpected phone call. It was Billy, the homeless man he had met outside Bright Care Veterinary Clinic. "Keanu," Billy said, his voice trembling. "I need your help. Max. He's not doing well." Keanu's heart sank. "What's wrong?" "He's been throwing up all night," Billy said, "and he won't eat or drink. I don't know what to do." "Where are you?" Keanu asked immediately. Billy gave him an address, a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Keanu grabbed his keys and drove there as quickly as he could. When he arrived, he found Billy sitting on the curb, cradling Max in his arms. The small dog looked weak and listless, his eyes half closed. "We're going to get him help," Keanu said firmly. "Come on, let's get him in the car." A familiar face. Keanu drove Billy and Max to the nearest clinic, a small independent practice he hadn't visited before. The receptionist greeted them warmly, her demeanor a stark contrast to what Keanu had experienced at BrightCare. "We'll take a look at him right away," she said, leading them into an exam room. "Don't worry about payment right now. Let's focus on getting Max stable." The veterinarian, Dr. Morales, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She examined Max carefully, asking Billy questions about his symptoms and medical history. After running a few tests, she diagnosed Max with pancreatitis, a potentially serious condition, but one that could be managed with treatment. As Dr. Morales explained the treatment plan, Keanu felt a surge of gratitude. This was exactly the kind of care he wanted to make accessible to everyone: compassionate, professional, and free of judgment. After the exam, Keanu asked to speak with Dr. Morales privately. He explained his vision for the nonprofit veterinary network and asked if she would consider joining as one of their founding veterinarians. Dr. Morales listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "What you're proposing is ambitious," she said, "but it's also desperately needed. If you can make it work, I'm in." The first step. With Dr. Morales on board, Keanu and Chris took their first tangible step toward building their network. They secured a small space in the city to serve as the pilot clinic and began renovating it with the help of volunteers and donated materials. Keanu personally contributed the funds to cover the remaining costs, determined to see the project succeed. The clinic, named HopeVet, was designed to be more than just a medical facility. It would also serve as a resource center for shelters and pet owners, offering education on animal care, support for adoption efforts, and access to affordable supplies. Keanu envisioned it as a beacon of hope, a place where no one would be turned away. As the grand opening approached, the media took notice. Reporters flocked to the site, eager to cover the story of a Hollywood star using his fame and fortune to make a difference. Keanu was careful to keep the focus on the mission, redirecting questions about himself to highlight the importance of accessible veterinary care. "This isn't about me," he told a reporter during an interview. "It's about the animals and the people who love them. They deserve better, and we're going to give it to them." The backlash. Not everyone was supportive of Keanu's efforts. Several for-profit clinics, including BrightCare, saw HopeVet as a threat to their business model. Dr. Porter, in particular, was vocal in his criticism, accusing Keanu of undermining the industry and devaluing veterinary work. Keanu remained unfazed. He knew the backlash was a sign that they were making an impact. "If they're worried," he told Chris, "it means we're doing something right." Chris grinned. "You're like a one-man revolution, Keanu." "Not just one man," Keanu replied. "It's all of us. And we're just getting started. A new beginning." On the day of the grand opening, the clinic was buzzing with activity. Volunteers hustled to set up tables and chairs, staff prepared to welcome their first patients, and a crowd gathered outside, eager to see the new facility. Keanu stood at the entrance, greeting visitors and answering questions. He felt a swell of pride as he looked around, seeing the dream he and Chris had worked so hard to bring to life. When the ribbon was cut, the crowd erupted in cheers. HopeVet was officially open, and its first patient, a stray cat brought in by a local shelter, was soon being examined by Dr. Morales. As Keanu watched the clinic come to life, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was just the beginning, but it was a start, a chance to make a real difference in the lives of animals and the people who cared for them. And for Bruno, for Max, and for all the others who had suffered in silence, it was a promise that things would get better. Together, they were building a future where compassion and care would always come first. Rising storms and unbreakable resolve. HopeVet's grand opening marked the dawn of a new era in compassionate veterinary care. The clinic's mission, to provide affordable, judgment-free care for animals, resonated deeply with the community. Within days, the clinic was flooded with calls from pet owners and shelters alike. Some were desperate for help, while others simply wanted to thank Keanu Reeves and the team for their groundbreaking initiative. Yet, as HopeVet flourished, so did the resistance. A warning from the shadows. It began with subtle murmurs, anonymous comments on social media, questioning the sustainability of HopeVet's business model. Soon, the whispers turned into outright hostility. For-profit clinics, fearing a loss of clientele, launched a campaign against HopeVet, labeling it a publicity stunt and accusing it of devaluing the veterinary profession. Keanu first became aware of the backlash during a quiet evening at Paws of Hope. He was sitting in the shelter's lounge, flipping through the day's updates on his phone, when Chris walked in, holding a printed email. "Keanu, you need to see this," Chris said, handing him the paper. The email was from an anonymous sender. It was laced with veiled threats and warnings, accusing Keanu of destroying the veterinary industry. The final line read, "Stay in your lane, Hollywood. This isn't your world." Keanu read the email twice, his expression unreadable. He finally looked up at Chris. "This isn't surprising," he said calmly. "When you challenge a broken system, it fights back." Chris frowned. "We need to take this seriously, Keanu. What if it escalates?" "It probably will," Keanu admitted. "But that's not going to stop us. If anything, it just proves we're doing something right." Sabotage in the dark. The threats escalated within weeks. One morning, Dr. Morales arrived at HopeVet to find graffiti sprayed across the clinic's walls. The message was blunt: "Close or else." Keanu was called to the scene immediately. As he stood in front of the vandalized building, his hands clenched into fists. Volunteers and staff worked around him, scrubbing away the hateful words, but the damage was more than physical. It was psychological. Dr. Morales approached him, her face a mix of frustration and determination. "We can't let this intimidate us," she said. "But the staff is nervous, and I don't blame them. Whoever did this might not stop at graffiti." Keanu nodded. "We'll increase security," he said. "I'll cover the costs. Cameras, lights, whatever we need." "And what about the staff?" Morales asked. "They need to know we've got their backs." "I'll talk to them," Keanu promised. "No one's going to scare us into stopping." That evening, he gathered the HopeVet team in the clinic's small meeting room. His presence alone seemed to bolster their spirits, but it was his words that truly inspired them. "I know this is hard," he began, his voice steady, "but what we're doing here is important. For every person or organization trying to tear us down, there are hundreds of animals and their families depending on us. We can't let fear stop us from doing the right thing." The room was silent for a moment, and then one of the vet techs, a young woman named Hasha, raised her hand. "We're with you, Mr. Reeves," she said. "All of us. We'll see this through." The team echoed her sentiment, and Keanu felt a swell of pride. They were more than colleagues. They were a family united by a shared purpose. An unexpected ally. The tension reached a breaking point when Keanu received a call from a prominent veterinary association. The president, Dr. Ellis, wanted to meet with him to discuss HopeVet's impact on the industry. Keanu agreed, though he suspected the meeting would be more of a confrontation than a conversation. They met at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in the city. Dr. Ellis was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with sharp features and an air of authority. He wasted no time getting to the point. "Mr. Reeves," Dr. Ellis began, "I'll be honest with you. HopeVet has caused quite a stir in the veterinary community. Some see it as a threat. Others view it as a wake-up call. I'm here to figure out where I stand." Keanu leaned back in his chair, meeting the man's gaze. "I'm not here to compete with anyone," he said. "I'm here to fill a gap that shouldn't exist in the first place. If that upsets people, maybe it's time to look at why." Dr. Ellis studied him for a moment. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "The system has its flaws. But running a clinic like HopeVet, it's not sustainable. You can't rely on donations forever." Keanu nodded. "I know that. We're working on long-term solutions, grants, partnerships, even a sliding scale fee system for those who can afford to pay. But the bottom line is this: no animal should suffer because their owner can't pay up front. Dr. Ellis' expression softened slightly. You're passionate about this. I respect that. And I agree. There's room for improvement in our industry. Tell you what, I'll reach out to some of my colleagues. If we can find common ground, maybe we can start pushing for systemic change together. Keanu extended his hand. Thank you, Dr. Ellis. That means a lot. As they shook hands, Keanu felt a glimmer of hope. Change was slow, but this was a step in the right direction. A defining moment. The turning point came a week later when Hope Yvette received a high-profile patient. A local police dog, injured in the line of duty, was brought to the clinic after being turned away by a private practice due to lack of funds. The story quickly went viral, casting a harsh spotlight on the for-profit clinics and highlighting Hope Vet's mission. The incident sparked a wave of public support. Donations poured in, and volunteers flooded the shelter and clinic, offering their time and skills. Even some of the critics began to soften their stance, realizing that Hope Yvette wasn't just a threat. It was a necessity. Keanu watched it all unfold with a mixture of relief and determination. The battle wasn't over, but they were making progress. Hope Vet was no longer just an idea or a single clinic. It was a movement, a promise to keep. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Keanu returned to Paws of Hope to check on Bruno. The German Shepherd had made remarkable progress since his first seizure, thanks to the care and attention of Chris and the team. As Keanu sat beside Bruno's kennel, the dog wagged his tail and leaned into Keanu's hand, his eyes filled with trust. Keanu smiled, his voice soft. You're the reason we started this, buddy, and we're just getting started. Chris joined him a moment later, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. You know, he said, handing one to Keanu. I never thought we'd get this far. But you made it happen. We made it happen, Keanu corrected. And we're going to keep going. For Bruno, for Max, for every animal out there who needs us. As they sat together, the warm glow of the shelter lights spilling into the darkening sky, Keanu felt a deep sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. Because when it came to protecting the voiceless, there was no such thing as too far. A revolution of compassion. The Hope Yvette Clinic hummed with life. Staff moved efficiently through the clean, bright hallways, tending to animals that had been rescued, abandoned, or brought in by desperate owners who had nowhere else to turn. The walls were adorned with photos of happy, healthy animals, symbols of the clinic's growing success and the lives it had saved. For Keanu Reeves, this was a sanctuary, a testament to what compassion and determination could achieve. But the battle was far from over. Hope Vet's rapid rise had sparked a nationwide conversation about veterinary care, and with it came both allies and adversaries. Today, Keanu stood at the heart of that storm, preparing to take the fight to the next level. An invitation to the spotlight. It started with an email. Keanu had just finished reviewing the monthly report from Chris when his phone pinged with a new message. The subject line read, Invitation to Speak, National Veterinary Ethics Summit. He raised an eyebrow as he opened the email. The summit, hosted by a coalition of veterinarians and animal welfare organizations, was a major event in the industry. They were inviting him to deliver the keynote address, a chance to present his vision for reform to an audience that included the very people who had criticized Hope Vet. Chris, standing nearby, noticed Keanu's thoughtful expression. What's up? He asked, setting down a stack of files. Keanu held up his phone. They want me to speak at the Veterinary Ethics Summit. It's a huge platform. Chris whistled, impressed. That's big. Are you going to do it? Keanu hesitated. It's an opportunity to reach the people who can make systemic changes, but it's also walking straight into the lion's den. Not everyone there is going to be on our side. Chris gave him a reassuring smile. You've never backed down from a challenge before. This is your chance to show them why Hope Yvette matters." Keanu nodded, his resolve solidifying. "You're right. If we want real change, we can't just talk to the people who agree with us. We have to face the ones who don't." The summit. The summit was held in a sprawling convention center, its main hall packed with hundreds of attendees. Veterinarians, shelter workers, policymakers, and animal advocates filled the seats, their chatter a low hum of anticipation. Keanu stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to his lapel. Dr. Morales and Amelia, the journalist who had helped expose unethical practices, stood beside him, offering words of encouragement. "You've got this," Dr. Morales said. "Just speak from the heart. That's what got us this far." Amelia nodded. "And remember, you're not alone. Everyone at HopeVet is rooting for you." When Keanu's name was announced, a ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Some faces lit up with recognition and excitement, while others remained skeptical. As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. He began simply, "Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm not a veterinarian, a shelter manager, or a policymaker. I'm just someone who loves animals and believes they deserve better." Keanu spoke about Bruno, about the moment he realized how broken the system was, and about the countless stories he'd heard from people turned away by clinics like BrightCare. He described the vision behind HopeVet, not as a replacement for the existing system, but as a catalyst for change. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," he said, his voice steady. "It's about lifting everyone up, about creating a world where no animal suffers because their owner couldn't afford care. We're proving it's possible, and I'm here to ask for your help to take it further." He ended with a challenge. "Imagine what we could achieve if we worked together, if every clinic, shelter, and organization joined forces to make care accessible to all. That's the future I want to build. And I hope you'll help me build it." The audience erupted into applause. Some stood, clapping enthusiastically, while others remained seated, their expressions contemplative. Keanu knew not everyone was convinced, but he had planted a seed, and that was enough. Building momentum. The days following the summit were a whirlwind. Keanu received an outpouring of support from unexpected places. Several veterinarians approached HopeVet, offering to volunteer their services or adopt its sliding scale model. Animal welfare organizations pledged funding and resources, and shelters began reaching out for partnerships. Even Dr. Ellis, the skeptical head of the Veterinary Association, called to congratulate Keanu on his speech. "You've made me rethink a lot of things," he admitted. "I'm not saying I agree with everything, but you've started an important conversation." But with the momentum came challenges. Critics continued to attack Hope Yvette, accusing it of undermining the industry and setting unrealistic expectations. Keanu and Chris faced logistical hurdles as they worked to expand the network, balancing growing demand with limited resources. One evening, as Keanu sat in the shelter office, reviewing yet another proposal, Chris walked in with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you could use this," he said, setting one down in front of Keanu. Keanu chuckled, taking a sip. "Thanks. It's been a long day." Chris leaned against the desk, his expression serious. "You know, we've come a long way. But this isn't sustainable. We need to think bigger, long-term funding, more clinics, maybe even a training program for vets who want to work in shelters." Keanu nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. We need to create a foundation, a central organization to manage everything. Something that can outlast us." Chris grinned. "I like the sound of that. What do we call it?" Keanu thought for a moment, then smiled. "The Compassion Network. A legacy of hope." The creation of the Compassion Network marked a turning point in Keanu's mission. The foundation brought together shelters, clinics, and animal advocates under one banner, coordinating resources and support on a national scale. It launched educational programs, funded scholarships for veterinary students committed to shelter work, and established emergency funds for low-income pet owners. HopeVet became the flagship clinic of the network, a shining example of what was possible when compassion took precedence over profit. Its success inspired other clinics to adopt similar models, slowly shifting the culture of the veterinary industry. Bruno, the German shepherd who had sparked it all, became a symbol of the movement. His story was shared at every Compassion Network event, reminding everyone why they fought so hard for change. He lived out his days at Paws of Hope, surrounded by love and care. The final chapter. Years later, Keanu stood outside a new Compassion Network clinic, watching as the staff prepared for its grand opening. The building was bright and welcoming, its walls adorned with murals of animals and the people who cared for them. Chris joined him, a satisfied smile on his face. "We did it," he said. Keanu nodded. "We did, and it's just the beginning." As they stood there, the sun setting behind them, Keanu felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. They had built something lasting, something that would continue to make a difference long after they were gone. For Bruno, for Max, and for every animal who had suffered in silence, they had created a legacy of hope. And that was a revolution worth fighting for.